Welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on Cards Radio 790 WKRD. This is the show that's about all the great stuff going on at the University of Louisville. We talk about research, we talk to students sometimes, we talk about programming, and what's coming up on the calendar at UofL. So hopefully you'll stick around for the next half hour or so, and you just might learn something. All right, on the show today, a UofL audiologist will be here to talk about dizziness, vertigo, the risk of falls, and what you can do about it. We'll also hear about a study of sleep problems in youngsters and how that may be a portender for other problems with those kids. But first, we know there are achievement gaps in our schools based on the race of the child. We know some of the factors that play into that. But what about the rate and way that black and white kids are disciplined in school? Ben Fisher is an assistant professor of criminal justice and has studied this issue. Ben, good to have you back on the show. Appreciate you coming back.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right, this is a really interesting study that you worked on. I read it, and why don't you start off with you looked at achievement gaps, and you looked at the disparity also in how basically white and black kids are punished in schools, and there's a link between the two. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you introduced it very well. We've known for decades that on average, students of color, especially black students, achieve at lower levels than their white peers, as measured by standardized tests. We also have known for decades that students of color, again, especially black students, get excluded from school via discipline practices like suspension and expulsion at higher rates than their peers. And although there's sort of an intuitive link between those two gaps that I'll be calling them, so the racial gap in achievement and the racial gap in discipline, it's only been recently that people have started thinking about whether those gaps are linked. And the empirical work that has tried to study that, the extent to which they're linked, has really only been limited to localized settings, maybe a single school district. And so our study builds on some of that theoretical work that's been done and examines this at a national level. So we use data from at the school district level using information from 3rd through 8th grade students, looking at both the achievement gap and the discipline gap between white and black students and white and Hispanic students.
And this was national, right? So how many kids are you talking about here? How many schools did you look at?
It was in the realm of thousands of school districts.
Okay.
It includes every school district that we can that has sort of a sufficient number of both white students and minority students. So when we start getting into small numbers, we run into some statistical problems, so we kick out those districts. But the ones that remain are what we're working with.
All right, so you're looking at the achievement gaps in all these school districts, and you're also looking at the way that the kids are disciplined in those school districts. What'd you find?
Yeah, essentially they're, like folks have been thinking about, they're very much linked. And so, but it works a little different for black and white students than it does for Hispanic and white students. So for black and white students, what we're seeing is that the two gaps, both the achievement and the discipline gap, are driving each other. So as one goes up, the other goes up. And we're not able to disentangle the direction of that relationship. We don't know. It's sort of a chicken and egg problem. We don't know which is coming first. But we see that they're driving each other to some extent. With Hispanic and white students, on the other hand, we're seeing that although those gaps both exist in the same sets of school districts, it's other sorts of factors from outside that are really driving those gaps. So it might
income, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yep. You got it. So characteristics of the district and its environment.
All right. So just to clarify here, again, we're talking with Ben Fisher, who's in the Justice Administration Department at the University of Louisville, and has done a study on the gap between the performance gap between black and white kids and Hispanic kids, and throw them in as well, and also what the discipline gap is and whether there's a correlation between those two. And I think what you're saying is, A, there is a correlation for sure among black and white kids.
Yeah, yep.
But are you saying that the reason that black kids are performing worse than white kids in the classroom is because they are disciplined more?
So
is there a direct correlation? That's what I'm asking.
So there's a correlation, but as my undergraduate students would be very proud to hear me say, correlation does not mean causation. So we're not able to say that one of these is causing the other at this point. And part of that is because we have the data measured at the same time. We don't know if one was measured before the other by a year or a semester, we might be able to disentangle that, but we don't have that information yet.
Okay.
And so what we're pointing to is this link, and we're hoping that future research is able to disentangle which comes first.
Mm-hmm. But again, you mentioned the difference between in the gap between white and Hispanic kids was a little bit different right, than the difference, the gap between white and black kids and the amount of discipline and whether that played into or had a correlation with the achievement gap. And so kind of repeat that I think what you're saying is that the gap with Hispanic kids it could be other factors, income, where they grew up, those kinds of things, right?
Exactly, yeah. So even though we're still seeing the same gaps exist, we still see that white students on average achieve higher than Hispanic students within the same district, and Hispanic students get suspended more than white students in the same district. The link between those isn't as direct. It's some other third variable problem that we're dealing with here that it's maybe a characteristic of the community from which kids are coming to the schools, or other factors that we haven't necessarily measured in our study.
Ben Fisher is an assistant professor of criminal justice and has studied this issue that we've been talking about for the last few minutes here. When you're looking at this issue from a parental perspective, and parents who are interested in seeing what their kids do in school, obviously in Jefferson County there's been a lot of talk about that, how much more or how much greater the discipline is, or the number of disciplinary incidents are for African American kids than for white kids. But as a parent, if you're looking at this, what should you take from this if you're the parent of a black child?
Well, knowing the local context a little bit, and knowing the efforts that folks are putting into decreasing both the achievement gap and the discipline gap. As a parent, I would hopefully feel a little bit hopeful that the efforts that we take, if they're successful in closing the achievement gap, they're likely to also have benefits for closing the discipline gap, and vice versa. When we're making changes to the way that schools do discipline in a way that makes it more equitable, we're also likely to see more equitable outcomes in terms of achievement.
And maybe you didn't look at this, but did you find school districts that were out there that seemed to be tying the two together to say, if we can get these kids to improve the achievement, in the classroom, that we may get rid of some of the disciplinary problems they're having, or vice versa. If we can get these kids to behave better in class, or teachers not discipline them as much, maybe we can improve their test scores.
Yeah, that's not something we looked at directly in our study, but there is a growing literature, and anecdotally I've heard many school districts talking about this, where they're focusing on first improving students' social and emotional skills, or the climate of the school in which kids are learning, that realizing that these improving the social environment is likely to also have benefits for sort of the academic outcomes that pay the bills.
Yeah, I think Terry Scott from the College of Education, I don't know if you've worked with him at all.
Yeah.
Have you worked
with him? He does
great
work.
Yeah, I think he's working on something similar to that. So we're doing that work here at the University of Louisville. Are there going to be any federal government changes because of this study and perhaps others? I think you mentioned in part of your study, the U.S. Department of Justice and Education recently rescinded the discipline guidelines set up during the Obama administration for kids. So what's going on with that? Will there be any changes? Any more changes?
I mean, you're asking. I can't predict what's going to be happening.
Well, I know you can't predict. You can't predict policy and politics and government. Come on, Ben, what's the matter with you?
But the implications of our study do directly speak to that. That when the Obama era guidelines around school discipline were very much focused on equity, and although there maybe wasn't the explicit tie to those specific policies having benefits for the achievement gap as well, our study suggests that those benefits may be there. That we see that as one goes up, so does the other. As one goes down, so does the other. In terms of that racial gap, and so we're optimistic that working on closing one is going to have benefits for closing the other. So the decision to rescind those guidelines we see as problematic.
Problematic or stupid? And that's a blunt question from a former reporter. Sorry.
I don't have tenure yet, Mark.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. You better stay away from that one. All right, Ben Fisher. It is always good to talk to you, and these studies that you put out are just very interesting, and I find them fascinating. So I appreciate you being on the show. You or your parents may already have this problem: dizziness, vertigo, leading to the potential for falls. Brittany Brose is a faculty member in the UofL School of Medicine and sees patients every day as an audiologist with UofL Physicians and UofL Health, and hopefully she can help us solve these problems. Brittany, it's good to see you.
You as well.
All right, so is there a problem out there with folks who suffer from dizziness and vertigo? Is it widespread?
It definitely is widespread. Falls end up being one of the leading causes of injury accidents in older adults. And honestly, about 1 in 4 people over the age of 65 will have a fall. And that can lead to very serious injuries, especially if it does require some kind of emergency room treatment and can have lasting impacts on people.
Okay, so you're an audiologist.
I am.
You look at ears.
I look at ears all day.
Okay, so people are going to say, well, how can she stop me from falling?
Right. So really the biggest thing is trying to determine and trying to assess people for their risk of falls. So what I do every day as an audiologist is I look at ears for hearing, but I also look at ears for balance. So we have an inner ear of balance as well as an inner ear of hearing. And I try to determine if there is a problem with the inner ear that's potentially causing someone to feel off balance, feel dizzy, that could lead to a fall. As an audiologist, I can then also assess multiple other potential risk factors for falls to try to intervene as early as possible and try to prevent as many falls as we can.
So do you diagnose folks that walk in and say, hey, I'm feeling a little dizzy, and I'm 62 years old, and I'm feeling a little dizzy. Can you look at my ears and see what's going on? Is that what you do?
It is. So to a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
So it's definitely a team approach. So I'm going to try to assess if something is caused by the inner ear. And then if it's not caused by the inner ear, I'm collaborating with someone's primary care doctor, an ear, nose, and throat doctor, physical therapist, occupational therapist, eye doctors. It's definitely a team approach, trying to figure out the cause of someone's unsteadiness and then hopefully to help prevent them from falling.
When a person gets vertigo or dizziness, and it's day long kind of thing, I would think normally they'd call their primary care physician, right?
They would often, yes. So sometimes we are seeing patients well after they really have started feeling dizzy, which is honestly okay most of the time. The primary care doctor or emergency room physician is there to help very acute issues. And then we come in when we're trying to figure out, okay, this hasn't gone away. Where is it coming from, and what do we do now?
We're talking with Brittany Brose, who's a faculty member in the UofL School of Medicine and sees patients every day as an audiologist with UofL Physicians and UofL Health. How many folks do you have walk in on a weekly basis that walk in to say, I'm feeling a little dizzy, or I've got some vertigo, I want my ears checked to see what's going on in there? Is it rare, or is it
No,
normal?
it's pretty common. Now, there's definitely severity of how unsteady someone feels and how dizzy they are. So we do, between me and my colleagues, are probably evaluating 5 to 6 patients every single week for a full dizziness evaluation. However, when we have people that come in to discuss their hearing problems, we also are asking questions to determine if they're feeling dizzy and trying to triage those people to where they may need to go and determine if they do need to see us for a full evaluation.
And how often is it then that you find something in the inner ear that perhaps could cause this dizziness, and worst case scenario, could cause a fall?
It's pretty often. Now, whether something is always the inner ear is not necessarily the case, but someone's risk of falls is typically, they don't just have one risk factor for falls. They have multiple risk factors. And the more risk factors they have, the more at risk for falling they are. So if we can even address 1 or 2 of those risk factors, we're hopefully lessening that impact.
Not to get too technical here, because I probably won't understand it if you explain it, but what is it in the inner ear or inside your ear that can cause vertigo or dizziness?
So we have lots of different pieces and parts to our inner ear that can become disordered or can stop functioning the way that they should and can cause that problem. Someone may also have some what we call intrinsic risk factors for falls, so internally within themselves, and some of those can be addressed, some of them can't. Some of those are just, as we age, things break down. And so advancing age and diabetes and other health conditions can all cause a risk for falls. But then there are extrinsic factors like loose rugs in the house or dim lighting, glares from a window because the shades aren't drawn, things like that we can try to ask more questions about to find out if maybe that's what caused someone to feel unsteady, someone to fall.
Or if they're on hardwood floors and using their sock feet and
Absolutely.
or sliding around
Yes.
a little bit, those
Yes.
kind of things. But in general, I think I guess what I'm asking is, does it mean that if you get vertigo or if you get really severe dizziness, that it can be treated and it can go away?
It can. It just depends on what it's coming from. So
Man.
there are
How
definitely.
about if it's in the inner ear? Can you?
It depends on where in the inner ear.
Of course
yes.
it is.
Yes.
There's variables, I'm sure.
There are.
All right, Brittany Brose is a faculty member in the UofL School of Medicine and with UofL Physicians and UofL Health, and she sees patients with them. All right, I want to switch gears just a little bit. Since you brought it up, as you get older, you start having hearing problems. What's the most common hearing problem that folks who are, say, 60 and over walk into your office with?
Most of the time, it's what we call a sensory neural hearing loss, or something that is affecting the actual organ of hearing and the nerve. It can typically cause problems with clarity of speech, because often people will come in and they go, I can hear people talking to me just fine, but I can't really understand them. And they will notice that problem a lot more often when they're in background noise or very noisy situations.
That's me.
Absolutely. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And one of the biggest ways that we can evaluate that and then potentially treat it are hearing aids. And there is potentially a tie with hearing loss and dizziness, and with hearing loss and anxiety and depression, which all can play into how steady you feel as well.
Right. But the idea of being able to drown out to block out the background noise when I'm in a crowded bar, if I'm not sitting right across the table from you and looking at you while you're talking, I can't hear a word you're saying.
Right.
So it's all that background noise. But there are now hearing aids that can take care of that and wash that background noise out, correct?
Absolutely, yes. The technology in hearing aids has definitely come a long way from what I think a lot of people still imagine hearing aids to, one, look like, and two, perform like, too. So they've made a lot of great research and development advances in hearing aids and how well they isolate someone's speech, because that's typically what we're trying to hear, and really try to make that come to the forefront above all of that background noise, because life is unfortunately very noisy.
All right, Brittany, how do folks find you if they think they have a hearing problem or just need to get a checkup?
Absolutely. You can schedule any appointment with University of Louisville physicians within the audiology department. I see patients every day, and there are multiple of my colleagues that do as well. So we'd be happy to evaluate people, especially as we go into this holiday season. People are going to be around their family members a lot more and may notice some things that might need to be addressed.
That mom or dad may need to get checked.
Exactly.
I got you. All right, Brittany Brose, that's Brose if you're looking for it on the UofL webpage. Brittany Brose, faculty member of the UofL School of Medicine and audiologist. Appreciate you being on the show. If you've got a kid having some sleep issues, there likely might be something a little more sinister going on. Nick Peiper is adjunct faculty with the School of Public Health and Information Science, who has done some research on sleep problems and mental health issues in kids. Nick, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So you don't actually work in Louisville, though, do you?
I'm here frequently, but yeah, I guess technically I reside in Georgetown, Kentucky.
And then in modern technology, you're using a computer. You tell
Exactly, yeah. So on the phone a lot. I have my Bluetooth headpiece, a lot of video conferencing as well, and then just come into the office if there are client meetings or other classes that I teach.
Right, gotcha. All right, so you are with the School of Public Health,
Yep.
correct? And you did a research paper, I guess. You did some research on kids with sleep disorders and that may be linked to something else going on. What was the study and what you do?
Yeah, so the study was what's called a longitudinal study with youth in Covington, Kentucky. My colleague at the Pennsylvania State University was the principal investigator, Dr. Diana Fishbein. So my specific role in the study was being an analytical consultant and a co-investigator. So as part of that, I help design a lot of the measures and run the analyses that we're seeing in this manuscript.
And so tell me, what is it? What was the study? What were you looking at?
Yeah, so we were essentially tracking kids from several school districts up in Covington. Yeah. And that had kind of been identified as a place at high risk for cannabis use and other drug use, and this was based on other state data sets that we looked at. So kind of the premise of the study was to understand sleep problems and how they relate to psychiatric symptoms and neurocognitive deficits before these kids start using substances and other things that can kind of make that relationship really messy to look at. So as part of that, we started tracking kids when they were about 10, 11 years old.
Oh, so these are young kids. These are
Yeah,
not teenagers.
yeah, these are early adolescents, like late childhood, early adolescence, but we tracked them into late adolescence all the way up to basically college age.
Okay. All right. What'd you find?
Yeah, so we, as part of the measures, we used what's called the Sleep Habits Survey, and that measures several facets of sleep. So, interruptions during the night, total sleep, how long it takes to fall asleep, and we found kind of profound sleep problems, and we found that those problems were related to increases in psychiatric symptoms and neurocognitive problems. And when I say neurocognitive problems, this is like emotional processing, decision making, impulsivity. So essentially, lack of sleep and these sleep problems are leading to these kind of deficits that can lead to bad grades and other sorts of adverse outcomes that we don't want kids to experience.
Again, we're talking with Nick Peiper, who's an adjunct faculty member with the School of Public Health at the University of Louisville. We're talking about a study on sleep habits of much younger folks, 10, 11, 12?
Yeah, 10 to 12-year-olds.
So I guess the question here is, was there a direct correlation, or could you see a direct correlation between kids that were having sleep problems, that were restless in the night, to they were just starting to use drugs, or they weren't being able to pay attention in class, or something like that?
Yeah, so as part of the study, we purposefully started off with kids who we called substance naive. So they hadn't ever had a sip of alcohol, they had never smoked a cigarette or really done anything. And typically,
of course, they're 10, 11, and 12 years old. They shouldn't have.
Exactly, yeah. But unfortunately, Kentucky, we have some differences with our national counterparts in terms of like when kids start using these substances.
Start using them younger in Kentucky.
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah, and kind of very quickly graduate to more kind of abusive patterns, unfortunately. So yeah, as part of this study, we kind of organized students into 4 different groups. So 2 of those groups had really pronounced psychiatric problems and neurocognitive deficits, and we've kind of found that the sleep problems were most related to those groups.
And so you found those groups that you had kids that had some neuro problems, and so what's the message here, I guess, to parents? If your kid's having trouble sleeping, pay attention. There might be something else going on.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, don't take sleep for granted. I mean, we're just starting to find out so much in terms of the human brain and the kind of benefits that sleep can have in terms of repairing the brain and doing other sorts of tasks to make sure that we can function normally. And again, since we were looking at substance naive kids, the message is that these problems start early and they kind of precede other things that we typically put together with mental health symptoms and neurocognitive deficits in terms of drug use and other high-risk behaviors. But these things are evident really early on. So instead of kind of waiting until there's a problem and kid enters treatment, we should really kind of be going what's called upstream and addressing these issues in late childhood, early adolescence, before there's really an opportunity for these problems to turn into something serious.
Don't blow it off if your kids are having trouble sleeping is the bottom line.
Exactly,
on this
yeah.
one. Okay. Again, we're talking with Nick Peiper, who is with the School of Public Health and Information Sciences at the University of Louisville. We're talking about a study of sleep habits and not cognitive things, but neurological potential problems in kids. And you said, you started when they were 10, 11, and 12. You followed them till they were 18, correct? So how many of the kids that you saw that had sleep problems when they were 10 and 11 years old ultimately wound up when they were 18, doing drugs or having some, mental health issues?
No, that's a great question. Yeah, and those are some analyses that we're actually getting into right now, just in terms of looking at these patterns of psychiatric symptoms and neurocognitive deficits and seeing if there's changes over time. And what we're specifically looking at is the initiation of cannabis use and other illicit drugs, and seeing if those cause any shifts. And we kind of hypothesized that initiation of those drug use behaviors behaviors and other high-risk behaviors is going to kind of put kids in those situations to where they really need some sort of early intervention. So, those analyses are kind of underway
You're
right
still
now.
doing that?
Yeah, still doing it. But this was the baseline paper that kind of provided the framework for all of these longitudinal analyses that we're doing.
So if your child isn't sleeping well, it's a signal that perhaps there could be something more serious going on, but we don't know what percentage of those kids that have sleeping problems by the time they're 18 are going to have, neurological deficits, mental health issues, going to get into some serious marijuana use, those kinds of things.
Yeah. So again, we kind of found a lot of those deficits and problems in early adolescence, and now we're going to kind of track whether that leads to kids having to enter treatment and the other sorts of problems that can occur once they start using drugs and kind of come of age. And especially 14, 15 years old, that's kind of an age where the prevalence of substance use approximately doubles from like the 8th grade, 7th grade. So there's these kind of really sensitive developmental periods that we're going to kind of have our eyes on in those follow-up analyses.
And are the folks at the state level and state government taking a look at this and using any of the data or any of the outcomes of this study and using them to perform a better statewide look at this?
Yeah, so we're planning some outreach with state officials at the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, and those upstream approaches that I talked about. The people in the behavioral health prevention and promotion branch really kind of look at those youth issues. So at some point we're going to sit down with them and really just try to translate the information and come up with viable strategies at the state and community level.
So again, I think one last time it bears repeating. What's the message to parents?
Make sure your kids are getting enough sleep. Don't take it for granted. This is a really important facet and domain of health, and a lot of times we just kind of focus on drug use and mental health problems and kind of the usual suspects. But really, sleep here is something that should be valued, and it becomes harder and harder to deal with as kids get older and they have more and more expectations and they have these long, arduous days that they have to deal with. So, hopefully, if we can get sleep interventions going on at a community level, we may see reductions in these sorts of problems.
Gotcha. Nick Peiper, appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a bunch. All right. That'll about do it for this edition of UofL Today with Mark Hebert, which you can hear every Monday night at 7 and Sunday morning at 8 on Cards Radio 790 WKRD. You can also listen to the podcast of the shows on SoundCloud and watch some of the shows on KETKY and Metro TV throughout the week. Check out all the UofL news, videos, and events and everything going on at UofL at UofLnews.com. Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.